afternoon, Hartford. Welcome to the 6th episode of Voices of Veterans here at Hartford Public Access Television, Channel 5, which has offered us the opportunity to do a program with input from veterans and the various things that veterans are doing, and which we're so happy that the station exists for Hartford residents to have access to in the city of Hartford. Last night at a city council meeting, we saw a very good representation of what democracy should be all about in Hartford and across the United States. It was a packed city council meeting that had to do with the budgetary concerns that are currently affecting the city of Hartford, the state of Connecticut, and the entire nation. And one of the main resolutions that we put forward, in fact, there were two resolutions talked about last night on Hartford City Council. One of them is an anti-war resolution to cut back on the funding for the military-industrial complex and the war machine that has almost bankrupted the city of Hartford, significantly hurt the state of Connecticut and the entire nation as far as our ability to provide public services, social needs, care for our veterans, care for our people, care for their families. And I was very gratified to see, for a change, that this come out and be talked about by a huge packed amount of people at the city council meeting. So some of the things we're going to touch on today have to do with that aspect of public participation in the process, and that's what we like to see, and that's what we're concerned about, and that's what this program is a part of. It's the public voice of the veterans and the people, their families. I just received my recent copy of Veterans for Peace magazine, an organization which I belong to, and it is a magazine that has as its headline, Exposing the True Cost of War and Militarism Since 1985. And on the VFP newsletter, there is an article about a gentleman who lives in Okinawa whose name is Ota Masahide. Former Okinawa governor and Veterans for Peace member Ota Masahide passed away on 12 June 2017 of pneumonia. He was 92 years old. He will be remembered as a fierce opponent of the U.S. military bases in Okinawa and a tireless advocate for peace. Forced into the Japanese military at 19 in violation of draft regulations, he witnessed the horrors of the Battle of Okinawa. After the war, while Okinawa was ruled by the U.S. military, he was one of the few allowed to study abroad. He graduated from Japan's Waseda University and received his M.A. from Syracuse. From 1958 to 1990, he taught at the University of the Ryukyus, serving both as chair of the Social Science Department and as dean of the College of Law and Letters. During his distinguished academic career, he published some 45 books in English and Japanese, largely on Okinawan history and contemporary affairs. Many sharply critical of Okinawa's colonial, now neo-colonial masters, Japan and the United States. In 1990, Ota retired from the university and successfully ran for governor of Okinawa Prefecture. During his tenure, he established an unprecedented, in Japan, model of the setting the precedent of the prime minister making the decisions. Ota signed an act about which opinions are divided. Also during his tenure, Ota established the cornerstone of peace, on which are carved in stone are the names of all who died in the Battle of Okinawa: Okinawan, Japanese, American, Australian, Korean, soldier and civilian, victims of battle and starvation and disease, murder, suicide, some 241,000 names in all. This memorial gives concrete expression to an utterly different way of memorializing war, and it was largely for this that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. It was also during his tenure that he brought noted Japan-China scholar Chalmers Johnson to Okinawa and gave him a tour of the bases there, which shocked Johnson into reversing his view of the necessity of those bases as related to the prefectures, to his prefaces to his celebrated books Blowback and Empire of Bases. Defeated for governor in 1998, Ota successfully ran for the upper house of the National Diet, where he served until 2007. In 2013, he founded the Okinawa International Peace Research Institute, where he collected valuable books, documents, and photographs on Okinawan history and peace issues, and where he continued his research and writing projects. He was considered a rebellious governor. In Okinawa, much of the land on which U.S. bases are located is privately owned. The Okinawan owners have contracts with the central government. Many owners oppose the bases, and when their contracts expire, they refuse to sign new ones. Under Japanese law, the governor can sign in their place, and before Ota, all had done so. Governor Ota refused, which meant that the U.S. military was occupying the land illegally. The central government quickly changed the law to allow the Prime Minister to sign them. In 2016, Ota joined Veterans for Peace as a charter member of the Ryukyuo Okinawan chapter and offered Veterans for Peace office space in the International Peace Research Institute. He was appointed to the Veterans for Peace Advisory Board. His mind still sharp as a razor, he gave talks to both in 2015 and 2016 Veterans for Peace delegations to Okinawa. As the public memorial held for him in Naha after his death, hundreds of people of all ages in a line that spilled onto the street came to bid Ota farewell and to burn incense in his memory. The reason that this has such bearing to myself personally is that I lived for 3 years on Okinawa. My father was a career military officer, was stationed at Fort Buckner in the island of Okinawa, which is part of the Ryukyuo chain. And it should become well known to the American public that military bases the United States occupies all over the world are in Japan, Okinawa, Korea, Germany, Guam, and we used to be in the Philippines full force too. One of the things that is not well recognized by the American public is that every single one of these military bases, with their, not only the soldiers and service people, but their families, are the first targets in any kind of war that would be launched, say, from North Korea or China or the Soviet Union. So all of these soldiers and their families are basically held hostage to whatever the effects of the politics are at that point. And I think the American public needs to understand that we're the first line of defense and also the first line of casualties. We will be, those of us on the military bases, will be the first casualties of war in anything that starts. And I think that the United States needs to, people in the United States need to understand and appreciate what that means and what that means towards the rest of the country also. The cost of running these military bases is phenomenal. Trillions of dollars in federal tax dollar goes to the upkeep and the staffing and the continual arming of these bases all over the world. And today, one of the reasons why what's happening with North Korea has taken such notice, and they talked about Guam, people were very much unaware of the fact that the United States occupies Guam as a territory, similar to what we do with Puerto Rico. These are our Commonwealth territories that are not states. The citizens who live there, while they may be United States citizens, do not have full citizenship and cannot vote in presidential elections because they're not members of the state. So these are all remnants of the colonial past of the United States when, after the Spanish-American War, we took over the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico from Spain. And we held on to them for over 100 years. To this date, Puerto Rico is still struggling with the idea of whether they become a state or remain a commonwealth or become independent. These are all vestiges of the colonial empires that Europe and the United States participated in over the years. This is a part of our history that really needs to be talked about. And as someone who used to live on Okinawa, I can really appreciate what an individual like Masahide Ota did, trying to reclaim the land for the people of the Ryukyuan Islands, who actually do not consider themselves to be Japanese, even though their culture is very much, is very much in that tone. They are a separate people. They have their own separate history and their own languages. So last night at the Hartford City Council, members of my citizens of my neighborhood from my city came together to talk about the cost to the American public of the war machine that we're surrounded by. We have federal contractors in this state that get big federal contracts to make weapons of war. Electric Boat, Sikorsky, GE, Pratt & Whitney, they're all getting monies from the tax dollar to provide jobs for people that live here. In the meantime, the Hartford City Council is at war with its own constituents over funding for things as vital as libraries, public schools, neighborhood community centers, health care, and those things that are social needs for the people that actually live here. Last night, there were over 100 people at the City Council meeting, and they were all talking about the fact that the Hartford Public Library wants to close 3 branches of the library, which the community is very vocal about maintaining. We need to take a look at where the money that's going towards, the federal money is going towards the arms merchants and should be going towards social needs of the people in the city. All of this against the background of the fact that we're still involved in 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even, I would say, still involved in wars in the Horn of Africa and Somalia. We still have troops actively on the ground in all of those theaters, including very large military bases and naval bases in the Persian Gulf. On a regular basis, our veterans are under threat from forces in the Persian Gulf, from Iran and from other countries who look at us as being as impinging on their territory. What right do we actually have to occupy the Persian Gulf? What right do we actually have to have a base with 10,000 military personnel in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia? By what rights do we have any of these military bases all over the world? This is a very good book that I've already talked about once before. It's called The Evil Hours, written by David J. Morris, who is a former Marine who served in Iraq. And I'm going to read a few things about what the psychology of what the United States is going through. As a Marine lieutenant, I'd always been told in times of uncertainty to go to the library. Read, get smart. Don't reinvent the wheel. Look at the history. It's likely that someone before you has faced the same challenges you face now. So I went to the largest library within a day's drive of my home, in this case at the University of California, San Diego, and began methodically working my way through the stacks. What I found was surprising. PTSD may well be the Esperanto of psychiatry, but its research literature is remarkably chaotic. Taken at a distance, the world of trauma studies resembled an arcade at the state fair. Along one side was a series of stalls populated by psychiatrists, psychologists, and neuroscientists. Along the other were poets, memoirists, historians, and anthropologists. The barkers within each stall might call out to you singing the virtues of their worldview, but there seemed to be little overlap between these various groups, let alone coherence. The result was a wash of statistics and anecdotes that offered no logical point of entry for the common observer. As I would learn, PTSD, as it is understood today, is a very heterogeneous disease, essentially a junk drawer of disconnected symptoms which include a numbing of emotions, hypervigilance, always being amped up, social isolation, and a variety of intrusive manifestations such as nightmares and hallucinations. The field of trauma studies embodies the fragmentation, with each subspecies of researchers rarely poking their head out of their own little stall, to continue the metaphor. This sort of siloing of expertise is common throughout academia. But with the problems of trauma, it is usually counterproductive because, as Jonathan Shea, a pioneering trauma theorist, likes to point out, trauma impacts the whole person, by which he means it affects every aspect of a person's life. In the months that followed, I would enter therapy at the VA, take part in 3 research studies, visit 3 historical archives, and interview scores of researchers from across the country looking for an answer to one question: what is PTSD. The more I looked, the more I found that my initial impression held true. Mental health is an unusually demanding and at times confounding line of work, but I was astonished to learn that few clinicians were familiar with the literature of the Vietnam War, from which PTSD emerged, nor did they possess an even rudimentary understanding of the global war on terror. One leading VA researcher I spoke to didn't seem to know where Fallujah was, nor, as I learned, had she ever read any of the work of Tim O'Brien. Similarly, many of the leading historians on the subject remained willfully ignorant and in some cases openly dismissive of the scientific research relating to post-traumatic stress. One British author of an influential history of military psychiatry went so far as to brush off the neuroscience behind modern trauma studies as completely dubious. It would be foolish to diagnose an entire nation with a mental health disorder. But as Susan Faludi points out in her 2007 book, The Terror Dream, Fear and Fantasy in Post-9/11 America, the country as a whole continues to exhibit certain aspects of post-traumatic stress, including a compulsion to reenact the events of September 11th in movies and television, as well as nurturing obsessions with homeland security and surveillance that, according to many military analysts, is out of proportion with the actual threat and smacks of a kind of national hypervigilance. Moreover, the ongoing militarization of American culture in the form of first-person shooter video games, the rise of the Navy SEAL brand in books, films, and other media, and martially themed endurance races like the Tough Mudder series points to a fixation with the post-9/11 hypermasculinity and ubiquitous violence reminiscent of the disorder. In a related vein, some observers have drawn connections between 9/11 and the recent helicopter parenting phenomenon, the overweening desire to protect our children from every conceivable danger to the point where we isolate them from the world and prevent them from having experiences that previous generations took for granted. Something as simple as letting your children ride a bicycle around the neighborhood, which my daughters did all their time the day we lived in Hartford. They would go out with a group of 2 or 3 of them and just ride their bikes around the neighborhood. Now it's almost considered dangerous to allow a child to walk down the street or ride a bicycle anywhere. Others point to the rising popularity of zombies in books and films as being symptomatic of a kind of paranoid cultural PTSD. Zombies are like terrorists in that they look like us but have been tainted by death and can seemingly strike anywhere and at any time, or so the thinking goes. Indeed, one can quite easily construct an entire theory of recent American culture using PTSD as a nucleus, all without mentioning the tens of thousands of veterans and their families who suffer from post-traumatic stress, or the millions of rape victims who live every day amped up, numbed out, and generally haunted. PTSD has become a bit like Prozac in the 90s. If you hear about it once, you hear about it 1,000 times. In trying to address these questions and balance the various academic disciplines that inform our understanding of post-traumatic stress, these pages may display a bias toward literature. Part of this is simply the result of my being a writer. But there is also the fact that the bulk of human history, literature, has been the primary repository of knowledge about war, famine, genocide, and natural disaster. From the Iliad to the great war poets to the literature of the Vietnam War, writers have been wrestling, and wrestling quite well, I might add, with the mysteries of trauma. In a sense, nothing has changed, and today's trauma survivors can take great comfort in knowing that they are confronting the same horrors that Achilles faced 4,000 years ago. Moreover, as practically any therapist will tell you, during many of the long-term effects of trauma are the products of the emotional interpretation of events by the victims, interpretations that are informed by the archetypal narratives that exist within a given culture, a process that is explicitly literary. As Robert Stoller, an influential psychoanalyst, argues, the experience of trauma is content-dependent, meaning its essence lies in the subjective experience of the victim. In other words, their story as they tell it to themselves. I'm going to read to you a little bit now of a piece that I wrote for an underground newspaper called the Hartford Undercurrent, which used to publish quite a bit of things by those of us who are writers. This particular piece is called Who is a Warrior? I was hooked in the eye by the warrior ethos from the day that I could read. I am the firstborn son of a career U.S. Army officer. My father is a retired colonel who gave 35 years of his life to the military. He not only gave himself, but he gave us to the Green Machine. My mother and my 4 siblings were all camp followers. We trailed after my father, serving on posts all over the world and the USA. Overseas, every U.S. military post is a target, and in a real sense, an army of occupation. We would be the first to perish in a nuclear exchange or invasion. Our lives were hostage to the military-industrial complex, so I decided to become what I was living, a warrior. The motto that inspired me most was that reflected in the ancient memorial, "O stranger passing by, go tell the Spartans that here, obedient to her laws, we lie." This memorial is located at Thermopylae, the Hot Gates in Greece. It was here that King Leonidas and 300 Spartans with 700 Greek allies held the narrow passage against 100,000 Persians under Xerxes for 3 days. This story has mesmerized boys from the days of its telling. Driven by my desire, I trained my body like a Spartan. From the age of 12, I banged iron, lifted weights, and ran cross-country in high school. Stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington, I would leap off the front steps of our quarters, run 8 miles to the base gym, lift for 2 hours, and then sprint the half-mile home. By my 18th birthday, I was in the supreme physical condition. Against my father's judgment, I enlisted in the U.S. Army and volunteered for Vietnam. I wanted my war to prove my manhood and warrior status, and I got it. It was much later in life that I read more deeply about Spartan society. They separated boys at the age of 7 and indoctrinated and trained them for battle only. One of their training methods was used as a discipline was called tree fucking. On command, a file of 10 boys would ram their shields into each other's back, then charge an old oak tree and try to push it over. They would push their shield into the back of the boy in front and keep pushing until the leader was exhausted, then drop off to the back and ram their shield into the next boy. They would continue until the trainer said to stop or they dropped. The Spartan peers were required only to wage war. They did not work on hard labor. They had enslaved a community of original inhabitants called the Helots. The Helots grew all the food, fished, built, and made the clothes and weapons. The Spartans also indulged in secret police tactics. They had a group of peers called the Crypteia, who raided Helite homes looking for rebels at night. These night-skulking raiders murdered Helots in their homes. The Athenians also trained for war, but they did so while laboring in their trades. The Athenians were true citizen soldiers returning to the farm or work when they needed doing after the battle. I have found that being a man is just not being a warrior in battle. It is easier to pull the trigger than to play the guitar, easier to destroy than to create. As a father, I found going to work every day when you are in pain or under stress is tougher than running off to an adventure in a foreign land. As a paid mercenary, which is what the volunteer army is, you have no responsibility except to your squad mates. You have essentially abandoned your family and community to play war. I question the loyalty of the volunteer army at times and the contractors under arms. In ancient Rome, Cincinnatus left his farm when begged by the Romans to lead them into battle as dictator. After the battle, he shed his armor and returned to the land to labor, vowing never to stay as a dictator or warrior. His first loyalty was to his family and his land. I would like to think we can be as honorable and life-giving as these ancient peoples and take inspiration from the creators, not the destroyers. There's a very short little poem written by a Vietnam veteran and his Veterans for Peace thing. It's called The Bear. I was patient, living high on the mountain on grouseberries